This is Margaret Rudolf. As you can see, she's with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and she'll be speaking to us about developing Indigenous partnership for knowledge mobilization under SAON Arctic Roads. So Margaret, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry I couldn't be there, but quite a long ways from Alaska. So I am on the advisory panel for Arctic Roads, and I didn't necessarily want to dive into Arctic Roads, assuming a lot of people probably know a bit about it. We are rebranding a little bit instead of just calling it SAON Roads, calling it Arctic Roads, just to limit the number of acronyms in the title. And so here's an overview of the advisory panel. The goal of Arctic Roads is related to knowledge mobilization, particularly focused on Arctic Indigenous communities. And we do have 4 current members that are Indigenous on the advisory panel. We have one that is pending, and we're also actively recruiting for more Indigenous participation in the advisory panel. And so my expertise that I'm providing on the advisory panel is on co-production of knowledge. That's my research focus and expertise. And so that's where I wanted to present on, especially under this theme of knowledge mobilization and decision-making. And so co-production of knowledge, or CPK for short, is co-developing every step of the research process. And so here's just a logic model of a typical research process from the inputs phase, developments of partnerships when you develop a proposal, and then when you start implementing that project and developing tangible outputs, and then the outcomes, are you achieving your goals? Does it have societal impacts and perspective and success, as well as generally all of a project exists within a context that has a lot of influences. And so co-producing every step of the process does kind of start from the interpersonal part onwards. And a lot of co-production of knowledge literature is focused on the science policy interface. Again, it's co-producing every step of the research process with intended users, as well as the population that's intended to benefit from the project. Functionally, it's treating users as co-researchers and decision-making partners within the project. There's a paper that talks about the 4 principles of co-production knowledge, which is pluralistic, interactive, goal-oriented, and context-based. And I think the most challenging aspect within those 4 principles is the pluralistic aspect, because you're bringing in a lot of different worldviews and knowledge systems together. And so just having that shared understanding can be quite challenging. It's an intentional process that creates knowledge mobilization through the sense of belonging and the shared ownership over the data. So this is kind of the theory behind why co-production knowledge really works in knowledge mobilization. But when you're going to do co-production of knowledge with marginalized communities, such as Indigenous communities, you really have to consider the historical and present day context of that community, which is inequality, racism, colonization. And these must be addressed within the project and the intended impacts of the project. And you really need expertise from critical methodologies and Indigenous methodologies in order to accomplish co-production of knowledge with these communities. And that kind of, thinking about Rebecca's presentation yesterday, it is kind of thinking about which worldview and knowledge system is being prioritized within the project, and really considering that it's not always about scientific knowledge, but local and Indigenous knowledge. An example of a co-production of knowledge model that has Indigenous and critical methodologies within it is the Xiamya co-production of knowledge model, which came out last year in Ecology and Society. It's something I'd recommend looking at if you have not yet. So there's different modes of co-production of knowledge. You could focus on science working with community, and that is important for broadening participation in the sciences. But I think for a lot of communities looking to work with scientists is because they generally see the science policy connection, and they'd like to work within that in order to develop societal benefits themselves. Because again, it's the policies that are impacting the community. And so that's kind of the community priorities, what was relevant to them. And I think a long-term goal to think about is the sense that there shouldn't be these separations between science, community, and policy, that they should be together and working together and having these partnerships in systemic change. And that is really the goal of Arctic Roads. And so when you start having these concepts applied within Arctic Roads through expert panels, you have the different groups together talking about a topic such as harmful algal blooms, wildfire, salmon, things like that. And so here's just kind of an example of who potentially might be on an expert panel from, policy aspects of policymakers, managers, planners, as well as having Indigenous leaders, knowledge holders, scientists, agencies, Northern residents, and then organizations that provide climate services. And so when you have these different groups come together, they obviously have their unique perspective on the issue, as well as kind of needs that they need to have, such as infrastructure, funding, ethics, being inclusive to them, and those elements. So the Arctic Roads process, we have expert panels that kind of represent going across this basket weave diagram. And then you have the 4 phases of the Arctic Roads process, from phase 1, initiating the expert panel, phase 2, defining, assessing the impactful observables, phase 3 is when you start getting the technical aspects of it, such as the observing and data system requirements, and then phase 4 is when you develop implementation strategies. And I highlighted the integrated advisory process because it's not something that's not a prepackaged thing, and the advisory panel doesn't necessarily operate as like a top-down structure, but really is trying to facilitate a community of practice. And so while there will be expert panels working individually, we're hoping there's collaborations across, as well as with the advisory panel, understanding how the process better, developing tools and guidance on each one of these things in order to really push the field forward. So how does this process support co-production of knowledge? For phase 1, it's having the users and Indigenous groups participating from the very beginning, so you're co-producing. It's honoring that pluralistic aspect of co-production of knowledge. For phase 2, is spending time to understand the context through societal benefit assessment, as well as develop goals that are really grounded in that context of the communities that you're working with. Phase 3 is really focused on being interactive. And then phase 4, again, is developing that partnerships and knowledge mobilization. So knowledge mobilization from literature, kind of ending with this, it needs to touch on 3 things, which is relevance or salience, credibility, which could be uncertainty, both scientific as well as not understanding type of uncertainty, and legitimacy or the sense of fairness. And there are differences in perspectives of these 3 things from a scientist versus an Indigenous researcher. So from a scientist's point of view, so this is kind of tokenized and oversimplified just for the sake of trying to understand how there could be differences, is funding calls generally do dominate how research is done, because that's the funding source and what is innovated within funding calls. Scientists also too are generally interested in applying their expertise into a project. What is credibility for scientists? It's the scientific methods, the peer review process. And for legitimacy for scientists, it is the team dynamics. In the sense, is everyone being heard? Are they participating? As well as a project being non-biased and independent is generally the real view of a scientist. For Indigenous people, what's relevant to them is related to the community priorities. What are types of things that their community wants to achieve? You know, this could be, again, like related to wildfire, coastal erosion, salmon, those types of elements, and kind of working towards those things that are affecting them. Credibility is Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous methods. Generally, a project is looked at if it's Indigenous led or has adequate Indigenous representations. That way, they ensure that their worldview is being accurately represented. And legitimacy is almost the opposite of independent and non-biased. In just methodologies, it's having deep subjectivity to become non-biased and kind of understanding that relationship. But also it means shared decision-making and equitable distribution of funds. And then kind of again, bringing up that kind of question of which worldview and knowledge system is being prioritized in a project. So some activities for mobilization under each one of these things that could be done within a project. For relevancy, it's connecting to the local and policy context. It's supporting community-driven initiatives. So existing initiatives that the community is doing. It's having the outputs be accessible for the community, for policymakers. So thinking about white papers or tools. Timing, so decision making happens at a different time frame as research, but there could be ways to synthesize current information, the best science to impact policy, so policymakers can use those. It's also being culturally responsive to the communities you're working with. For credibility, it's having Indigenous representation and review and evaluation. It's respect of people and knowledge systems. And it's also related to uncertainty again, both scientific as well as uncertainty and not understanding. So that's one reason why co-production does work, is the shared ownership. It's focusing on the process over the outcomes and embracing complexity of the topic. Legitimacy is equitable distribution of funds and shared decision making again, but it's also conflict resolution, how you deal with tensions within a group as leadership. It's relationships, having that trust, reciprocity, and really kind of just having it being rooted in values. There's going to be in co-production knowledge with the pluralistic aspect, a lot of social learning, and showing that you are spending the time to understand someone else's perspective is a really important aspect for legitimacy. And then as well as communication and being transparent is also really crucial within a project to be legitimate. And so, yeah, thanks. If you want to know more about Arctic Roads, there's the website. Also, Jan is there in person, and there's my email. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Do we have some questions from the audience? Yes, Alex.
So my question was whether there are other regional efforts similar to this. I mean, this is polar in scope, in spatial scope. Are there other regional efforts around the world that are taking similar approaches?
Sure. You know, there are certainly, like, if you look at co-production of knowledge, there's a lot happening related on different topics. But I think in the sense of Arctic Rose, I'm not sure. And that's one reason why we wanted to rebrand and thinking that the tools and the guidance that we're developing in the Arctic would be useful in other regions.
Other questions? No. I think that you're going to be let off the hook, Margaret. So thank you very much.